Tenemos con nosotros al Premio Nobel de Economía, Joseph Stiglitz. Estimados y queridos participantes de Argentina, Bolivia, Colombia, Chile, Ecuador, Paraguay, Uruguay, Perú y Venezuela, de todo el UNASUR, aquí reunidos. Vamos a tener la oportunidad de dialogar, hacer una serie de preguntas con una de las mentes que más ha aportado al planeta Tierra en los últimos años, en esta reflexión sobre esta crisis económica mundial y este mundo tan complejo. Ustedes están todos estudiando en este momento el nuevo libro de Joseph Stiglitz, El precio de la desigualdad. Van a tener la oportunidad única de escucharlo. Yo lo voy a interrogar sobre algunos de sus aportes recientes de las últimas semanas y días. Conversamos con el profesor Stiglitz. Our first question, thank you very much for taking your time to contribute to our students of many Latin American countries. Our first question, you have made exceptional contributions in the last years to the understanding of inequality in our times, the role of inequality in economics, and its impact in policies. Your recent book, The Price of Inequality, is a mandatory reading of our international program. You said recently that there is a global inequality crisis. What do you mean by that?
Well, the level of inequality in many countries around the world has soared in the last 30 years. And both the way it's created and the magnitude and the dimensions have grown to a point where it is undermining our politics, our society, and even our economy. There is now broad consensus, for instance, at IMF, that inequality plays a very important role in contributing to economic instability. So even if you didn't think about this from a moral point of view, just from the point of view of how economic systems function, the way, the magnitude of inequality and the nature of inequality in our society has come to the point where it's undermining our economy, our society, and our politics.
Why have you said that inequality makes economics more volatile and vulnerable?
Well, there are actually many ways in which inequality affects the performance of the economy. Let me just give you two of how it increases volatility, instability. One of them we saw manifested in the United States and some other countries before the crisis. And by the way, I don't think it's just an accident that inequality soared in the years before the 2008 crisis and soared in the years before the 1929 Great Depression. It's one of the ways in which the Great Depression and the Great Recession have something they have in common. Well, the mechanism is really simple. When you have people who are rich don't spend all their income. They don't need to. People who are poor, people in the middle class, do spend all or almost all of their income. They need to get by. So when you take money from the bottom and you move it to the top, you get a weaker total demand. And with a weaker demand, the economy doesn't perform as well. Now, the Fed, central banks, respond to offset this, but they don't always respond wisely. So the Fed in the United States responded to this weak economy and said, well, we need to goose the economy. We need to stimulate the economy. And what did they do? They created a bubble. Low interest rates, lax regulation, succeeded for several years in offsetting the weakness that was setting in from this growing inequality. And they succeeded, but not in a sustainable way. So there was a housing bubble, and that sustained a consumption bubble. And when that bubble broke, and it was inevitable that it would break, the economy collapsed. That's one way. Let me give you another way. In democracies, and even actually in many countries that are not democracies, when you have more inequality, the people at the top get increasingly undue influence. How do they use that influence? To try to maintain that inequality. And what are the ways in which inequality is generated, say in the United States and many of the Western European countries? Through financial sector deregulation, through laws, tax laws, regulatory laws that benefit them at the expense of the rest of society. But the way it benefits them often contributes to instability. So the financial sector use their influence, result of all their wealth, to deregulate, and that deregulation set the stage for the instability that we saw in the United States and Europe and had global consequences. So those are two of the most important channels through which inequality has such an adverse effect on our stability.
Thank you very much. In your recent article in New York Times Sunday's Review, very, very important piece, you argued that economic inequality leads to political inequality and a broken decision-making process. You can elaborate more about this because this is very important, and you are one of the pioneers in introducing this connection.
Well, the manifestation of this connection are pretty clear. I was just talking about the role of the financial sector, all their money, all in shaping American politics. There are 5 lobbyists for every congressman. The congressman can hardly go to the bathroom without being chased by some lobbyist. Well, when you're surrounded by these lobbyists, what they do is try to sell their view of the world. And their view of the world is inequality is a good thing. Their view of the world was that financial innovation was going to make us all prosperous. The reality was otherwise. Paul Volcker, chairman of the Federal Reserve, not somebody who's hostile to a market economy, has said, can't find a single financial innovation in America that has led to better economic growth other than the ATM machine. And the ATM machine was a British innovation, not an American innovation. So what were all those innovations? They were all about circumventing regulation, undertaking more risk, innovations in deception, innovations in figuring out ways to take more money from the poor, more ways of engaging in abusive credit card practices, more ways of engaging in predatory lending, more ways of engaging in discriminatory lending without the government figuring it out. Now, is that innovation that makes any society better off? No. But the point I'm going to make is they sold the politicians, Congress, on the idea that all this innovation was a good thing. So that's an example of how they can use their money, their influence. They'll say, they're very explicit, we'll give you money if you pass the legislation that we want. And when some people in Congress, or the president said, we're not sure that everything you want is right, they said, we'll take our money elsewhere, find somebody who will vote the way we want. So it was not a gentle persuasion. It was very, very explicit. But it goes all the way down the line. Paul Volcker had been a very effective chairman of the Federal Reserve in doing what the main task of the Federal Reserve Board is doing, bringing down inflation, keeping it in check. You would have thought that having been so successful, he would have been rewarded, gotten another term. But under President Reagan, he was fired. Why? Well, the financial market wanted somebody that would do their bidding. Somebody that would believe in their ideology that unfettered markets are the way to go. And they found somebody in Alan Greenspan. If they hadn't chosen him, it would have been somebody else. And so began this process of deregulation, goosing the markets artificially, and focusing on inflation, not on wages, not on what was happening to workers. So everybody said the economy is performing well when inflation is low. Well, inflation may be one thing, but what is a measure of good performance is what's happening to most citizens. And today in America, most citizens' median income is lower than it was in 1996. And for workers, for male workers, things are even worse. The median income of a full-time male worker in the United States today is lower than it was more than 4 decades ago in 1968. So this is not a successful economy as viewed by most citizens. Yes, Bill Gates is doing well, GDP is doing well, but that's not the measure of how well an economy is doing.
Changing the subject, you announced it recently that you believe climate change is the most important issue facing the youth economy today. Why?
Well, climate change is a long-run problem. The full effects of climate change won't be felt probably during my lifetime. We're seeing some of the effect, greater weather volatility, Sandy, the storm that did such devastation in the United States, brought all these kinds of unusual weather patterns. But the full effects won't be felt in my lifetime. It'll be in the lifetime of the young people in 30, 40, 50 years. And especially in the developing world, especially in the tropics. The economic consequences are clear, but it has all other kinds of consequences. Health, there's a real worry that all kinds of disease vectors will get worse because of the change in the environment. There's a great deal of worry about increased conflict. When Bangladesh, for instance, a third of the country is going to be underwater, where are all those people going to go? Going to put pressure on the borders. Already those pressure on the borders. And that's going to be repeated over and over again. You see that in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. So we're going to see tensions mount as land becomes scarcer, land that's arable, land that you couldn't, water becomes scarcer, water that will be usable for irrigation will become more and more problematic. So I just think we're going to see more and more tension, so there's going to be both direct effects and there are going to be indirect effects.
And how do you see the perspectives to fighting climate change?
Well, I would have hoped that everybody would realize that this is a classic example of a global public good. We will all benefit if we address the problem of climate change. The problem is that the people who are doing the pollution, contributing to emissions, are disproportionately well off. United States, for instance. And the people who will suffer are disproportionately poor and in the tropics. Now that equation's been changed a little bit, that China has become the biggest emitter, although not on a per capita basis. The United States remains by far the biggest emitter on a per capita basis. So the United States is going to have to recognize the harm that it's doing to other countries. And it is in our collective interest for all of us to cut back on our emissions. I think we can do it without any significant compromise to our standard of living. But it's not going to happen if you bury your head in the sand and pretend it's not a problem. And it's particularly going to be difficult for in the United States because we were talking before about the influence of money. Well, one of the big sources of money are the coal and oil companies. And they are not only trying to buy Congress, they're trying to shape public opinion. They're trying to shape public opinion that it would be too costly for us to act responsibly and cut back our carbon emissions. Just like the wealthy have sold this bill of goods that inequality, reducing inequality would be very costly. And that's the main reason I wrote my book, to say that's wrong. We could have a stronger economy if we reduced inequality, that we would benefit from reducing inequality. And the same thing goes for climate change. I think we would have a stronger economy if we stimulated it by made investments that mitigated the consequences of the level of carbon emissions.
It's very interesting. The last week there is a survey that 68% of American people now are very conscious about the climate change. This was 48% 1 year ago. So,
well, Hurricane Sandy had an effect. The people are, and the drought in the summer had an effect. You know, it's one thing for the problems to be in sub-Saharan Africa.
Sure.
It's another thing when it's here at home.
Sure. In a recent lecture in India, some days ago, you titled your lecture, "What is wrong with economics?" You identify what you consider to be the 3 worst assumptions economists make and the bad policies these assumptions generate. Could you elaborate on this? What are the 3 worst assumptions that economists made?
What I was focusing on at the time, one of the assumptions was this assumption that inequality doesn't matter. So we worked very hard in macroeconomic models to create models in which there's a single individual. There's no inequality. We call it a representative agent model. Obviously, if you begin with a model with one person, your inequality doesn't matter because there's no inequality among whom. Interestingly, in those market models, there's also no financial markets because if you have only one person, who is he lending to? Who is he borrowing from?
Sure.
So
you call this the schizophrenic economics.
Yeah, very schizophrenic. And then that also is related to a couple of other assumptions. If you have only one individual, this representative agent model, then you can't have information asymmetry. How can different people know different things if there's only one person? The only way that that can happen is acute schizophrenia. And that violates the assumption, what I view as another really bad assumption, is perfect rationality. There are other problems that also simply can't arise. You can't have externalities. Externality where markets fail because you have impacts on others you don't take into account. If there's only one person, the only person to have an impact is yourself. So pollution is not a problem because you wouldn't smoke if it killed you. So you don't think of any effects on others. So it ignores externalities, assumes it away. One of the major problems, two of the major problems associated with the crisis of 2008 was, one, externalities. The financial sector had enormous externalities, and the rest of us, they brought almost the whole global economy to the brink of ruin. But also agency, where somebody takes actions that are not in the interest of those on behalf of whom they're supposed to be working. The managers of the banks took risks that were obviously adverse to the interests of the shareholders. They almost killed the shareholders, the bondholders. But again, when you have only one person, you don't have agency problems. So you look through the list of assumptions, you look through all the things that represent why markets haven't worked very well, and what you realize is that these models, which were central to the thinking in central banks, policymakers, people in Washington and other countries, ignored every one of the things that were related to bringing the crisis on. And no wonder then they didn't anticipate it. Even after the bubble broke, they didn't understand what the profound implications would be. They have consistently been overly optimistic about the recovery. The policies they put in place have not worked in the way that they hoped. It's been a disaster. And, I've said very frequently, the real culprit of the crisis was clearly the most to blame were the banks. But the regulators should also be blamed for not curbing the banks. But the economists should also be blamed, other economists, because they provided the models, the way of thinking that led the banks and the regulators to behave in the way they did.
In some opportunity, I invited you to talk about ethics for economists. What do you think now about ethics for economists?
I think the issue is even more important. Let me put it, it's not only for economists, but ethics in our society. Going back, you talk about the bankers. The bankers really have to be charged with moral turpitude. It's one thing to pursue profits. It's another thing to say, I'm going to engage in lying to the court, deception, trying to take money from the poorest people, violating our basic norms that you don't discriminate. It's been a half century since we said we were wrong to allow discrimination. We passed civil rights laws, and the banks violated those. They discriminated, they targeted poor African Americans, poor Hispanics. That's unconscionable. What were they thinking? How could they act that way? It's one thing to make profits, but to make profits out of the poorest people that were striving to become part of the American dream, I don't know how they go home and live with themselves. I really don't. So the banks, terrible. The rating agencies, same story. Put short-run profits over their moral responsibility. But the economists also, and there's been a very good movie documenting this, lots of writing.
Yes. Inside Job.
The Inside Job, showing very clearly the conflicts of interest. And if anybody should have been sensitive to the conflicts of interest, it's economists. That's, what is our profession about? It's about incentives. And there was one guy in that movie, Inside Job, when he was asked about conflicts of interest, he pretended he didn't even know what the word meant.
Yes.
What did that mean? The level of, one of the things I emphasized in the discussion that we had on ethics, to talk about, one of the things was honesty. Honesty to yourself, honesty to others. And what you see throughout all this is real patterns of deception.
There is a question that many people in the world now ask. How do you explain persistence in Europe in pursuing austerity-based economic policies when, as you state, and very recently at Davos, in January, at the end of January, you state that this is a course that plunged Europe as a whole into recession and the United Kingdom into a triple deep downturn. How do you explain the persistence in the policies? This is a question that many people in the world are asking.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and in a way it's a mystery. I've always been amazed at how strong people can get beliefs that are they continue to maintain in spite of evidence to the contrary. There's some cases where the evidence is ambiguous, and there always is some degree of ambiguity. But this is one area where the evidence is pretty unambiguous. You go back to 1929, back to the stock market crash. Herbert Hoover tried austerity, and we got the Great Depression. IMF tried austerity, impose it involuntarily on Korea, Thailand, Indonesia. Each of the cases, downturn, return to recession. And then they went to Latin America, yes, and they succeeded in getting a crisis in Argentina. In most of those cases, the patient was involuntary. They were told you had to do it. What I don't understand is how UK, intelligent, well-educated people, doing it voluntarily. Greece is austerity, not voluntarily. The reality is it can't borrow. So its room for maneuver is very small. But the UK has room for maneuver. The US has room for maneuver. People don't understand that the US has also begun austerity, not under that name, but reality. We have now something like 700,000 fewer public employees than we did before the crisis. 700,000. And if we'd been expanding normally, we'd have 1.8 million more public sector employees. And that gap is one of the sources of the weakness in the U.S. economy. So it is in part the government that is weakening the economy.
You was in Davos 2 weeks ago, and in Davos was congregated the elite of the world. What conclusions do you draw from Davos?
Well, there are many things that were going on. On the positive side, this issue that we've been talking about, inequality, was on everybody was talking about it. I think the issue of inequality has finally risen to the level where people are beginning.
You help very much in this.
I hope so.
I help in Latin America, you help in the world.
so I think that's the first thing, that the debate has changed. Absolutely. And to me, one of the symptoms of that was when the Economist magazine, a generally conservative magazine, had a special symposium on inequality, and they came to exactly the same conclusions that I did.
Yes.
So across the political spectrum, people are getting worried about it. So that's the first thing. I thought that there was a sense of complacency about the euro crisis. Understandable in some ways because of the dire predictions in the previous Davos. Would the euro survive 2012? And at the end of 2012, people could take a sigh of relief and say it had survived, and all you harbingers of doom and gloom were wrong. And now we can be confident that the euro will survive. Well, to me, that was a little bit reminiscent of what happened in 2004, 5, and 6 with respect to the U.S. economy. I gave talks in 2004, 5, and 6 saying, look, there's a housing bubble going on. Each year it was getting worse. I said, economists can't tell when bubbles are going to break. The longer it goes, the worse it's going to be. I remember Davos 2007 saying, look, I'm really in an embarrassing position, I said. I've been saying that there's a bubble. I'm saying it's eventually going to break. And yet, it didn't in 2006. Actually, it had already begun to break. But at 2007, at that particular moment, I said, look, there are two hypotheses. What I always said is that the longer it goes, the worse it's going to be. That's one possibility. The other one is my theory is wrong. My theory, I looked at the numbers, I looked at the imbalances in the American economy, I looked at the housing income ratio, I looked at all these things, and I said, this is not sustainable. This is not a judgment call, this is not sustainable. Well, I was right. It was not sustainable, and 2007, things started to unravel. By December of 2007, we were in recession, and then things got worse and worse and worse. So we don't know whether the euro will make it. The fact that it's made it for one more year is good news, but I think anybody who says we've solved the problem is putting their head in the sand.
In a recent interview, you talk about the Nordic countries, and the Economist dedicated one of the last numbers. The top story was the success of the Nordic countries. What are the lessons that we can learn of the Nordic countries' experience?
Well, obviously every country is different, and so you have to look very, very closely at the differences in circumstances. Sure. But what I think the Nordic countries have so many lessons. The value of education, having a highly trained labor force means that they can adapt better to changing circumstances. A good social safety net, protection, means that people can take more risk because if they fail, there's a safety, there's a social protection there. So it actually is good for innovation and risk-taking. It makes for a stronger economy. High taxes. One of the finance ministers of the finance minister, one of the country's foreign finance minister, asked him, to what do you attribute your success? He said, high taxes. Of course, that's just the opposite of what you hear from the right wing in the United States. He said, high taxes are a disaster. I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, we know that if a society, an economy is going to function, you have to be responsible. If you spend money, you have to raise taxes. But we also know that there are very high returns to investments in public infrastructure, public technology, public education, public health. All these things that make for a cohesive and well-functioning society. Yes, private expenditures are important, but so are collective expenditures well managed. And they've shown that you can have well-managed collective expenditures. And they can be far, far better than private decentralized markets. Not everywhere, but for instance, in health and pensions. Our healthcare system, private mostly, though a lot of the money comes from the public, but it's privately organized, is the most dysfunctional healthcare system. We spend a lot more to get a lot less. So that's an example of an efficient public provision. So what they've done is they've broken out of all the ideological molds, gone ahead doing it the right way. Interestingly, they also even addressed their problems better. So, for instance, they have financial crises. Financial crises are global. And they had that in the 90s, and when that happened in, say, Sweden, they did exactly what I said they ought to do, and what I think most responsible economists said. They said, you make the shareholders and the bondholders pay. And then the government comes in to protect the financial system. What do? Massive giveaways to our bankers, to their shareholders, to their bondholders. What do you wind up with? A divided society that says, why are we giving money to the guys who brought our economy down? They didn't do that there. And the interesting thing was that when President Obama was asked about this, he said, it's not the American way. But actually, it is. Because we say we believe in the rule of law. The rule of law says what you can't pay what you owe, you go into conservatorship, you go into bankruptcy. That's the rule of law. Bailing out, giving money to the rich is not the rule of law. That's the rule of the powerful. Having the bankers force people out of their home, saying that they had examined the records when they, signing affidavits to court when they hadn't, is not the rule of law. And it's not the rule of law to say when you do that, but if you're a banker and you lie to the court, no punishment. Pay a little fine. That's not the rule of law. So in fact, I think we violated our principles, our way. And Sweden has been much more true to the principles of a market economy.
And Iceland, no?
And Iceland has restructured the debt. The result of restructuring the debt is the economy is doing much better than the economies that did not restructure their debt.
Finally, you are a very good friend of Latin America. Latin America has been interesting developments in the last years, and some of the countries, Uruguay, Argentina, Brazil, and others reduce poverty and improve inequality. What is what you think the world can learn of Latin America experiences in the last years?
I think there are two important lessons. The first is inequality is not determined just by market forces. A lot of people in America sit back and say, oh, inequality, it's supply and demand, it's just the way it is, and just take it. The market forces, supply and demand, globalization, those are global. But the United States has the highest level of inequality of any of the advanced industrial countries, and among the worst levels of inequality of opportunity. So it's not just market forces, it's how you shape the market forces. So the first important lesson is our decision. And Latin America has shown that you not only can you make decisions, you can change. Latin America is the place in the world with the most inequality, and they said we have to stop. And they show you can reverse course. So it's an element of hope for the rest of us. When I give lectures, I always talk about Latin America, and I say, you know, it's not a foregone conclusion that things will get worse and worse and worse. But I hope we don't have to wait until inequality gets to such high levels that our society is at the brink of dissolution. The second thing that we can learn is by taking a closer look at the specific policies. What they've shown is that policies do make a difference. The governments have instruments, tools that can really reverse the underlying forces for inequality. Education, probably the most important thing. Access to education for all. But the very innovative programs that are being tried in Brazil and in other countries, no young person should go hungry. No young person should go without health care. The United States has still not recognized these principles. So if poor countries that are much poorer than the United States can recognize these principles, not fully executed yet, but at least say, these are things that we ought to be aspiring to, working towards. If Latin America can do it, so can America and other countries that have more resources. So in a way, I think Latin America is really changing the global debate.
We thank very, very much Nobel Prize Joseph Stiglitz for his fight for a better humankind, for his intellectual, so important contributions for the mankind. And from Latin America, we thank him especially for his permanent contributions to Latin America. We thank you in the name of the Latin American Development Bank, CAF, the University of Buenos Aires, the many universities of all the countries of UNASUR that are jointly organizing these international programs. Our best wishes for you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.